Hello, everyone. Welcome to wasmCloud Wednesday for Wednesday, February 19th. Let me go ahead and share the agenda. We've got a couple of good discussion items today. No demo that I'm aware of, but like I've said before, anybody's welcome to do a demo at any time. So I will take an impromptu demo. It's all good. I am taking a look at the agenda today. There were a couple things that I wanted to discuss. The first one being an item that we talked about last week, which is combining Wash CLI and the Wash library, the two separate crates in our repository. Thank you again to Ahmed, who is a wasmCloud maintainer, for taking on this work. I know that it's like the yak shave of the century, but it's a huge help because this is just going to increase our ability to release Wash quickly and easily. Last week we did mention that for now, if possible, let's try and avoid making big changes in the wash CLI crate and the wash lib crate, just so that we can kind of get this refactor done and then port the changes over. If there's something that's critical, bug fix, something like that, then it's really no issue. Just want to ease Ahmed's pain on rebasing and things like that. I wanted to one call attention that this work looks to be moving along really, really well. So the freeze has been going great. I think the only change that's causing some conflicts here, like I think we need to rebase off of main, but I've bumped wash to release 0.39, which will be at least as far as we can tell, the last release before we combine everything and release that as a single binary. So that is going to be great. I did, however, want to call attention to some of the things in the workflows that are failing, because I think that these might be affecting other PRs in the wasmCloud repo right now. So first of all, we have hit, in the CNCF as a CNCF project, as an open source project, we need to make sure that when we are Apache 2 license, that we are using libraries that are all compliant with that license under the CNCF's standard guidelines. So essentially, they have a list of software licenses, which they're cool with, and then a list that you essentially need to get approval for. So the cbindgen crate actually is under the Mozilla Public License 2.0, which is fine. There are a lot of CNCF libraries that are essentially there's like an exception granted for it. But Roman did go through and remove one of our crates that was using cbindgen. So that should help the license issue. But we're going to take a look into that and see if we can either remove the use of that crate for now, or we can start the process to get a license exception with the CNCF, which is not a huge deal. I just want to handle it out of band of this PR because it doesn't feel related. So Ahmed, if you're listening, or if anybody's setting a license change or a license failure, let me know, and we'll see what we can do there. But we're looking into it. Other than that, there are a couple other failures that are happening in CI that are not related to this change. Again, looks like there is looks like there's an issue which we have actually hit before where the CI runner runs out of space when running integration tests. LOL. So I'm trying to take a look into this. I might tap Roman, who has designed a lot of the CI for the wasmCloud repo, just to touch base with them, see if we can figure it out. And a DEI I saw, which this is a separate contribution, but implementing WASI key value watch in the host and in our capability provider for Redis. This is all functionally complete. I know we've gone through and approved this. It's awesome work. I did notice that your PR is hitting a failure here. So in lieu of doing a ton of live debugging, I just wanted to let you know, yeah, that there are a couple fixes that are going in right now relating to how we deal with cargo.locks um, and then there is one integration test on the wasmCloud host side that we're debugging. So this is really all just a PSA that we're taking a look we're taking a look into these things. I will let you know when you should rebase to bring in some fixes from main. But thank you so much for your patience on these. And we should be able to get this approved and merged in and all of that stuff. Okay, so kind of wrapping up the wash story. I'd really like to push this along as soon as possible because the longer these kinds of branches live out there, the longer or the harder and harder it gets to maintain these. Ahmed, I'm going to try and get back to you as soon as possible on some of these issues, see if we can reproduce them, fix them, all that fun stuff. But let's push this forward if we can. This is great. Do folks have any questions on the folks have any questions on CI? Do you have a pull request that's been experiencing blocking, anything like that? All right. Everybody's favorite topic, talking about workflows and CI. Okay, then that's all really there. Let's continue to hold off on doing any big features or fixes in Wash for now so that we can get this across the line. And I think we'll go from there. Okay. So moving on to the next discussion item is the upgrades and updates for wasmCloud applications. So I'll come off of share for a moment to address all of you. So we have some notion of updating components in wasmCloud today. We have a control interface operation called update component, where you can take a running version, a running component, let's say OCI version V1, from an image reference, OCI whatever V1, and you can update it to OCI whatever V2. And what the Wasm Cloud host will actually do is download those new bytes from your OCI registry or your image reference, will instantiate the component, so make sure that it's a valid component, all of the claims signing pass verification passes. And then as soon as that new component is ready, we will hot swap in the newer version of the component and then complete the upgrade. So this does a zero downtime upgrade. No invocations are lost because we don't actually change subscriptions. We don't change configuration. We just update to a newer version of the component. And this works pretty well. We actually don't do this we actually don't do this in wadm, and we actually don't do this in wash dev in order to upgrade to a newer version. But it is there, and you can use this to go from one version to the other. Now, doing this type of upgrade is often more complicated than just going from one version to the next. If you are changing configuration, say to listen on a different HTTP port or path, adding additional configuration, say your application now has the ability to work with a key value store or is changing the credentials, rotating the credentials maybe to interact with a database, etc. Totally. I mean, there's many different scenarios you can dream up. This doesn't really do that. You have to update the component and put the configuration, the links, etc. separately. And herein lies part of the problem. It's really hard. There's not an official mechanism in wasmCloud right now to do this. And I think it is truly something that we can have control over. And when you get to running these wasmCloud applications in production, you don't want to be taking on an arbitrary amount of downtime. You want to be able to recover from failures and roll back. And you want to know that when you deploy a new version of your application or a new version of your component, assuming you've already tested it and everything, you should know that that rollout should complete and be able to have insight into what's happening there. So I have a fairly large RFC that I've written up in the wasmCloud GitHub repo. Ping this in Slack this morning. There are a couple of different pieces to this RFC, so I'd love to talk through at a really high level what is included here, and then take any feedback, questions, comments, especially from the folks who are running wasmCloud. Maybe you've designed workflows around this already, but I'll talk a little bit about wadm here as well. So this RFC details the work that we need to do and past just the update component operation so that we can have really robust upgrades from one basically from one set of components or from one component and set of configuration to the next, and then vice versa, rolling back. So I've kind of introduced the forward and the motivation here, but the work for this comes in a couple of different parts, and they don't generally, other than the last step here, they don't really depend on each other immediately. So the first thing that I'm proposing is that wasmCloud should report status of running components and providers in its host inventory. So on the details here, this is what an entry in the host inventory looks like for a component. You have the component ID, the image reference it came from, the scale that it's running at, some nice, friendly information like annotations, but you don't actually know if the component is running, if it's stopping, if it's upgrading, and none of those are really valid cases for the component right now. Like it's either there or it's not. But I think for capability providers and components especially, it would be very helpful to report the status of these things at all times. So as soon as you send a request to scale a component on a wasmCloud host, I think it should immediately pop up in the host inventory as pending as something that's downloading from OCI. So this is just an example, but essentially right now, when you tell a host to go start a component, you'll get an ACK that it was a valid that it was a valid request and that it's working on it, but then you won't hear any other information about that request until an event is published on the wasmCloud event bus. So you have to send the request and then listen for events. And that's generally okay. It can be higher, it can be a little bit more annoying if you are downloading something large like a capability provider when you're on plain Wi-Fi, but that's like a really specific scenario. I think what I really want to surface here is just a general set of status in the host inventory, and then use these statuses like failed for when it fails to download from OCI, unhealthy for when a capability provider says, "Hey, I'm unhealthy." This is information you can kind of see in the wasmCloud dashboard today, and report that in the host inventory. Now, this would all be backwards compatible. It's just a new field. So no real big changes there, but in some, I think it would be great to be able to basically submit these requests or these commands to the host, and then the host inventory can reflect the progress there. If there was something that failed, you can see that it failed, and it doesn't depend as much as you catching an event that came out on the event bus that we basically just publish out and don't care if you miss it. So this is step one. Essentially, you having as a person interacting with wasmCloud, or as an operator like wadm, you having more information about what the host is doing in its internal state. Yeah, figuring out more than just taking a look at the logs. You can actually query for that kind of information. I think second, and this is it sounds like a bigger change, but it really is just moving the separation of concerns here. I think that we should try and avoid using the control interface commands that instruct wasmCloud to write to the NATS KV bucket, which is the lattice-wide state. So every single host running in the same lattice or the same networking namespace connects to two KV buckets, one for information about components and links, and two for configuration. So this has some really nice properties. We can share information. Actually have a nice diagram. So yay, this has some good properties. We can share information across all wasmCloud hosts running in the same lattice, using this replicated KV data store, which is in NATS. The problem about this is that these hosts actually write to the KV bucket as well. So if I tell host A and host B to start a component, and then I start sending out links or configuration, then both of those hosts are going to be writing to the same bucket at the same time. This rarely ends up being an issue. Nats KV is pretty good about catching you if you try to write to a key that's been written to since you read from it. I know that's a lot of words, but it can still happen. And a big downside of that is that when we one host writes to the source of truth, as you will, the other hosts essentially have to respect that and don't have an opportunity to essentially reject configuration, reject links. In theory, it should all be the same. For many scenarios, it is. But what I'm proposing is that we can keep the lattice data and config data buckets as they are as a source of truth, as something that we can use to essentially communicate things to hosts lattice wide. But I think we should attempt to stop using the link and config put operations, the things that where the host writes to the data buckets, and instead start introducing a wasmCloud control interface. I've dubbed it V2 Alpha 1. We can call it whatever we'd like, but introduce some new control interface operations that could bypass this. Now, the different parts I've essentially laid out in these diagrams, so feel free to take a look here. But this also would be a backwards compatible change with older host versions because the host can still support all of the old things that it used to. We're just adding in some new operations. I think that the newer I think that this one operation specifically, I guess we should have a delete too, but apply component spec. I'll back up a little bit to explain that one, but I think that this one new operation should essentially be something that we experiment with. It should be an experimental command, and we see how it works. I think that a lot of this work can be done. All of this work is beneficial, even if we don't like the design of a particular piece. So, um, the last piece that I'd like to touch on there is something you may or may not know about the internals of how wasmCloud works. When you start a WebAssembly component and then you configure all of its links by publishing commands one at a time to the host, wasmCloud is essentially taking all of that information and creating a single, you can call it a manifest, but a single spec. It's called a component spec that has all of the component information, all of the configuration information, everything that it needs to basically execute at runtime. And then it stores that in nats, and then all of the other hosts get that. Essentially, all I'm proposing here is to shift the responsibility of forming that component spec to wadm, to wash, to our client libraries, and essentially put all of that together and ship it to the host as a single bundle. We can use both APIs. There is no really restriction there. But what this does is this lets us deliver essentially all of the information for a single component deployment at one time, and then the host can reflect its status based on that. I am almost done with talking through it, so I'll pause for questions just after this last one, which I think folks is maybe a little bit more, um, maybe a little bit less internal or abstract. But right now, when we tell a provider to put a link, to delete a link, essentially to configure itself for an application or for a component, those are fire and forget operations. Though sends the message out, it's hoping that the provider is on the other end receiving it, but that is all that it knows. The host actually does not know if the provider is configured correctly at all. And I think that this is a big problem. This is something that we have compensated for in the past, but the change that I would also like to propose here so that we can know that rollouts are working correctly is making this a request. It really is not a big change. We are going to send a request to the provider, and then on the provider SDK side in Rust and in Go, we can send the response back. Now, the good news is this actually doesn't require any changes on the provider side at all. Like if you've built a capability provider using the provider SDK, we already let you return results. Previously, if you said, hey, I couldn't configure this because I couldn't reserve this port, then we would log it. But now we're actually going to send that message back to the host. And essentially, all of that is going to roll up into the host inventory or these queries to say, hey, you deployed your component fine, your HTTP server is running fine, but when you try to configure your connection, we couldn't find your certificate that you were trying to use for TLS. And so this is like this application has failed, and you got to figure that out. So about half of the changes in this RFC are essentially improvements on today's current system. So even before we get to the rollouts and rollbacks, I think observability on what providers are able to do, shipping more information at the same time to the hosts, those things are going to be just wholesale improvements. So I think we can start working on some of that, even if there are other things that we want to talk about in this RFC. But the rollout and rollback pieces is kind of the end result of all of this. I will pause just to see if there's any questions before I show this big diagram. Um, yeah, Masood, is the data watch operation event based or poll based? So this data watch, which is actually apologies, it's not reflected in this diagram, but the data watch is already happening today. That is essentially whenever there's a change in the KV bucket, that the wasmCloud host is um, pulling updates off of that data watch. So it is constantly watching to see if there's a change in the lattice data or config data bucket. And anytime, everything in Nats under the hood is a message on a stream. Anytime new messages come in on that stream, so, a new configuration is put, all of the hosts are essentially pulling that off of the stream immediately. So these hosts are just basically constantly watching for that. If they go down momentarily and then come back up, then they resume the watch from the last key that they saw, and we'll catch up on information. That answer your question? Is there any other follow-ups that you had there?
No, thanks. So it's like a control loop.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Okay, so just to wrap up this RFC, I know there's a lot of points to it. I would greatly appreciate anybody who takes the time to take a look at the proposal. I know it's I know that it's a lot to read, but I'm happy to address any feedback around clarity or things that I can help describe it better, because I want to make sure that this is understandable by everyone, even if there aren't even if you don't have intimate knowledge of the internals, like the component spec, for example. So at the end of the day, the goal experience that I have for a wasmCloud rollout is this. So I have user bookmarked, or essentially as an entity. Great. Here I have wadm, which is the application deployment manager, so the reconciliation loop. wasmCloud, which is some wasmCloud host, and then say in this application there is a capability provider that has essentially new resources that it tries to reserve, because this is important. It's an aspect of the upgrade. So me as a user, or pushing to CI/CD that says, hey, deploy a new version of my application. That request is sent to wadm. wadm internally will remove all of the control loop. We call them scalers, but the little entities that are watching for events in the wasmCloud lattice and then taking action based on that. We'll remove all of those so that we're not taking reconciliation action during an upgrade. We will mark the application as upgrade or upgrading, and then transform the manifest where you're deploying your application into the component spec format. So this component spec format will have the ID of the component, the image reference where it's pulled from, and then all of the links that are relevant to that component. That's the format that it is today. Um, we could talk about that too. I have ideas for the future, but that's what it is now. wadm will then send apply component spec to the host. So it'll say, hey, here's your manifest. You need to make sure that this is the reality. Like, here's your desired state. Go make it happen. And there's some older version of this component, the same ID that's running. So what we'll do is fetch the updated component from the new image reference. Obviously, if this fails, then we'll fail the upgrade and then roll back. Great. We'll instantiate the updated component, and this is actually like a wasmTime thing. So we will actually pre-compile and instantiate the component to make sure that all of its imports and exports are valid, make sure that it's a valid component, all the things like that. So essentially, we do our validation. And then for each new link or each new piece of configuration, we'll essentially send a request to the providers like, hey, get this configuration ready for this new component. The important thing here, or why the new link thing matters, is that for each new link, there's not going to be any additional state that the old version of the component is using. So we can establish those without worrying about conflicts, and then go from there. Now, for zero downtime upgrades, this is a pretty critical piece of the upgrade itself. I think there's different strategies here, but what I have essentially drawn out is at this point, when we've validated the component is correct, we have gone through, configuring new links, we will actually set the component to pending in the host inventory. We can pause handling invocations. So we're actually still receiving them on the wRPC subscription. We're still receiving invocations, but we're not going to actually execute the component, the old component, right now. For each link that has updated configuration, no. Sorry, I clicked on it. For each link that has updated configuration, essentially here, to have the least amount of changes in the provider SDK, we can request to delete the link and then put the new link. So essentially change the configuration. This one, I think we could maybe optimize by having an update config or update configuration. Just pushes a little more work on the capability provider developer to handle upgrades properly. And that's okay. I mean, that might be a good alternative. I think I have it outlined as one as well. Once we've updated all of the pieces of configuration, which for context, the amount of time that it takes for an individual host to send a message to a provider that it's managing is somewhere on the order of a couple hundred microseconds. That's the NATs back and forth. The important thing that may take time here is establishing connections or host resources. So there's still some scenarios to make sure that this works well for. Essentially, if this is it's not down, it's not missing invocations, but it's, essentially pausing on them. Then as soon as that all works properly, replace the old component with the updated component, resume handling invocations, and then finally return that update was or upgrade was successful. And then really at the end here, the important bit is that wadm can now monitor this application or this individual component for success. If this all went into the ready state, everything got upgraded correctly, then we can say that the application is ready. We can complete the upgrade and then kind of resume normal operations. if the component fails for whatever reason, failing to download, failing to establish a new configuration, um, that those are the big ones, then we can have wATM apply the old configuration, which is already essentially hanging out. We already formed it from before, and then wasmCloud can deal with that rollback. So there are a couple unresolved questions and conclusions here, but I do think hopefully this super verbose and tall application rollout diagram is helpful. But there are this is a particularly sticky issue with the way that Wasm Cloud can be so wildly distributed. So I want to make sure that each wasmCloud host is very focused on being its own agent, receiving a command to start a component and then being very good at that. And I want to leave the lattice-wide orchestration of these apps to wATM, which is the scheduler, which can have that higher level knowledge. I do really want to essentially stop Wasm Cloud hosts from having the ability to affect the lattice-wide state. So many different things there. Please, questions. Florian, go ahead.
Yeah, many thanks. So it was really interesting, but I was a little bit wondering, maybe I missed that point. You explicitly mentioned in the diagram the removal of the scalars in wATM in a non-destructive way, but you didn't include the reinitiation or recreation of these scalars in your diagram. So was this on purpose and is implicitly part of another step?
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I didn't include it in the diagram, but mostly out of neglect. It does belong there at the end. Essentially, after we've done the upgrade, we should reintroduce the new scalars, which are responsible for, if I manually tell Wasm Cloud to stop this component that wATM is managing, then the scalar for that component will say, hey, no, I do actually want this to be running, go start it again.
Okay, many thanks.
All right. Do folks have any other questions? General comments or suggestions for rollouts? It doesn't really need to be about my RFC specifically. If you have a use case that you wish Wasm Cloud would cover in an upgrade or a rollout or rollback scenario, that's infinitely valuable as well. I'm happy to. I took some scenarios, some things with folks that we're working with who are deploying Wasm Cloud in. I took some of those as inspiration in this RFC, but I want to make sure that I cover everything. So please feel free to, well, I'll pause now, ask questions, or let me know.
Yeah, maybe a follow-up question then, because you mentioned you already discussed some use cases. Didn't read the RFC though, so maybe it's covered. But usually people are asking, at least our customers asking about Canary deployments or blue-green deployments, something like that. Is this also in scope of the RFC or something you keep for later?
Yeah, this is something that is mostly kept for later as essentially as part of the rollout strategy. And I mentioned providers a couple of times in this as being essentially a difficulty. But just to set this stage, it actually would be really easy for Wasm Cloud now to run, so if we wanted to do an upgrade with a blue-green style deployment, you say, hey, upgrade, do blue green, here's my new component reference. It would be really easy for Wasm Cloud to take both of those components, run them at the same time, and then just only send invocations to one and then switch over to the other in response to a command, things like that. That only is easy if you're not changing configuration. And changing configuration is only hard because capability providers may contend for host resources. So annoyingly, one of the ones that comes up a lot is if you wanted to switch your HTTP address from, localhost 8000 to 8080, then what happens during the upgrade if port 8080 is already taken? And it is, I mean, it is truly a little frustrating because this is it's hard for wasmCloud to control those host resources. Um, but I think that once we have this pretty robust configuration swap in place, that will cover the hard case of like upgrading with new configuration. I think introducing Canary or blue-green or percentage-based rollouts at the host level would actually be really easy if we could say something like, if your application contends on host resources, then you need to not or be careful. Things like that. I think that that is a hard thing to reconcile here. I feel lame proposing that you basically just pay attention and make sure that there aren't any problems, but that would be a really nice way to enable those. Yeah, anyways, I went on a little bit of a rant there because of things out of our immediate control. But does that make sense? Like the um that wasmCloud totally is able to do this style of upgrade. It would just only it would only be something we could really tightly control the experience over if there's not changes that may break outside of our control.
I guess so, to be honest. So, I mean, this port example is a pretty good one, but if we consider, for example, a pass or a pass-based routing, so there would be less possibilities to break stuff, or actually everything is within the scope of the wasmCloud host, at least from my understanding. So there, I think it would be totally make sense. So as I said, so usually, so in Kubernetes and container-based, people definitely asking about that and assume this is definitely possible, especially if they use a managed offering. So and in wasmCloud, we or my understanding or impression of wasmCloud that it feels a little bit like a managed solution because you don't have to worry about so much details or as a user.
Yeah, that's essentially what we're trying to assert with the benefits of the component model, understanding what is happening inside of an application, and essentially us taking on the difficulties of making it distributed, making it load balanced, making it highly available, that you as a developer don't have to worry about the semantics of upgrading. We want to take care of that automatically. Or we don't that doesn't there's some level of pragmatism that you can't always chase, but it would be great for this system to handle that, just kind of like in Kubernetes, where you don't need to write something into your container to say like, if I'm upgrading, then stop handling requests and then hang out.
Yep. But also to be fair, usually third-party tools are used for that. So Kubernetes is not handling that natively. So here wasmCloud would be definitely pushing the border.
Yeah, pretty fair. I do really like I appreciate you bringing that up, with just the question, your second question in general, because I think it would be great to introduce some really nice upgrade, rollout functionality with the guardrails to say, hey, when you're doing this, when you're updating this component from one version to the next, you have this set of strategies, but you can't, um, here are the things in wasmCloud that you can't update during using this strategy. And that might give us a lot of gain, without losing much. I mean, how often do you really need to change the port that you're listening on in production when you're already like behind a CNI and everything, could be interesting. So you had a question, shouldn't something like this be an add-on? Would you mind, I'm not sure if you're in a place where you can talk, but would you mind adding a little more detail into what you're thinking there?
But I think Florian himself, mentioned that because if you take the Kubernetes model, is that you use different components for different purposes. In some sense, it's like having an add-on or plugin to the core functions of the Kubernetes to provide those additional, let's say, infrastructure, and I'm air quoting, infrastructure services. But going back to that suggestion, we talked about this some time ago. Actually, Bailey brought it up about an extension model, and it was brought up also, I think, but it was Jonas that mentioned if providers are filling that gap, or there are other things that, let's say, we expect in the communication between such an extension, or the cooperation between such an extension and the host, that doesn't fit the provider model. I don't know, right? But so, things like that people can extend the capabilities, like what they do on Kubernetes, right? And then let's say if they want to have blue-green, they can use that model of extension to add that, uh, you know, and then if it's like it could be shared or something, again, and we might even argue that providers can, fill that gap, or they need to be enhanced in such and such way to fill that gap.
Yeah, I think it makes sense, and it is part of our it's part of our responsibility for wasmCloud's control API to have the right operations, have the right API so that a higher level orchestrator or principal can actually extend wasmCloud. Because right now, if you're a superpower user and you wanted to write your own essentially mechanism to do this rolling update, you mostly can through some like a bunch of different control interface commands and making sure that that works. Um, I think that applying the one manifest will make it easier, but okay, great. I'm saying exactly what Bailey is saying.
And,
Where
and, and sorry, and I want to mention something.
mm,
Give you an example. Before Jonas gave us that fantastic news, at least from my perspective, that he's working on integrating a SPIFFE. I was looking into it, and I was looking into that delegated authentication you know, agent. Uh, and I was looking at what are the shortcomings in terms of the current framework that we have in terms of extending the host for such capabilities. And we see that to some extent in the NATS secrets provider that is running independently rather than being some sort of extension, let's say, right? Being standardized through that, and then have provide its own capabilities, such as the wash plugin in some sense, right? And over there, one of the things was that sometimes you need that extension or that provider to be local, basically enforce it through some policy that needs to be local to the host because of, for example, security purposes, which is one of the requirements when it comes to a SPIFFE, that agent communications with the agent must be local, right? They cannot be over the net, in the sense that traversing more than one host.
yeah. Yeah, so you're looking maybe at a combination of a couple of different things, but almost wash plugin style extensions for the wasmCloud host so that you can essentially provide your own functionality like the way that we've done for something that's well spec'd out and configured like secrets or policy or things like that.
And it could be common between wash and the host, right? I mean, right? Because once you provide capability for provider for something, you immediately make that available to the plugin to everything across the ecosystem, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we've definitely opted for, I mean, for the plugins, of course, I feel like for Wash, we are definitely going in we're going to embed components. We have a set interface that you can implement. On the Wasm Cloud host side, well, some of this predates the component model amazingly. We've definitely leaned in the essentially all of our host plugins are done over NATS APIs. We already have the networking infrastructure available to work with. It's just an interface that you implement over NATS. This lets you do things like, yeah, well, I mean, it cuts the dependency down to just a language that has a NATS library. Um, so I think having those extension points at the host in a more WebAssembly native way may be, um, I mean, we're not here because we don't like hard problems. I really would like to, I'd like to think about that a little more. Um, because it would be great to be able to extend the host functionality using, a custom implementation. Um, and do it in more of a WebAssembly native way over just having NATS APIs, which is fine. No big complaints there.
Roman has created all the examples, I have gone through his fantastic wRPC example for different transports and those.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's some fun ideas to talk about that we don't have enough time for in the rest of this meeting. Um, but yeah, everybody should definitely check out. So okay, I'll mention it in a second. But do folks have any other things that they wanted to touch on the rollouts and rollbacks RFC? Like I said, all of this is essentially proposed. I am planning on moving forward with some of the improvements discussed in the RFC, like providers responding to links, and reporting, and then proposing a good way to report status because they feel a little tangential. Don't let that stop you from commenting on those specific aspects. But I kind of view those as more as feature requests, like things that we should have fixed maybe before than the rollout mechanism. So yeah, do folks have any other thoughts there? Sweet. I know it's a ton of information. So hopefully the diagrams in there help a little bit. But feel free to tag me in Slack if you have any questions or things you want to talk about there. Okay, the thing I was going to say before that I didn't want to rabbit hole on too much, definitely go check out the RPC framework that we use for wasmCloud, which is wRPC. All of our components do their distributed RPC using this transport agnostic RPC framework, which is awesome. And essentially we do it so the components can compose with each other over the lattice using nets, and you don't ever have to worry about it, which is awesome. The cool thing is that wRPC is a protocol, but the transport agnostic bit means we may implement and use this in Wasm Cloud today using NATs, but you don't have to. There are implementations for wRPC at the transport level over NATs, over Quick, over Unix domain sockets. Um, and I see one called web transport, which I don't actually know what that means. Um, yes, you should, if this kind of thing interests you, I would highly recommend checking out that talk that Bailey just linked, which was, I believe, Taylor and Roman's talk where they, yep, actually showed off this framework. But always fun stuff to take a look at, especially if you're I think I recognize everybody on the community call, but this is a live stream, so anybody can be watching at any time, which is crazy. But thank you. Yeah, so that's your nerd snipe of the day. Make sure to go take a look at that if you are wondering how wasmCloud does some of its cool things. Okay, folks. I know that today didn't have the demo in the beginning, boo, and had a lot of discussion, aka me talking at you for like 45 minutes, boo. But I really appreciate you coming and listening and um, taking it all in and taking the time to do that. I think we've got another couple of minutes. Is there anything else that folks wanted to talk about on the wasmCloud side, broader WebAssembly ecosystem that we haven't covered? What? Okay.
Why did the balloon emoji trigger there?
Oh, I just did it because I was
Oh, that's great.
impatient.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I came off mute just to ask that. I
Yeah.
didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, it's like the super, yeah. Okay, we're getting off the rails here. All right. Thank you everybody for coming to the community meeting again. Looking forward to next week where we will be doing wasmCloud Wednesday on Wednesday, and we will have our normally scheduled mix of discussion and demos. So tune in for all the fun that you know and love. All right. Thanks everybody. Have a